For years, we presented Dubai to the world as a miracle, and it was. But today, I will not hide behind the image. The landmarks that made us famous, they are silent now. Airports that were once the beating heart of the world are growing quiet. The towers still stand, but the people who filled them have gone.
He said it. Not a leaked memo, not an anonymous source. Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum himself, the man who built every landmark now collapsing, who opened every airport now closing. His silence had been the most expensive silence in the history of real estate. And then it broke. He didn't break diplomatically. He broke the way empire builders break, when what they constructed begins coming apart, with specificity, with horror. Famous landmarks are collapsing. Airports are closing. He said it himself. The world waiting for official confirmation of what the data, the satellite imagery, and the abandoned Lamborghinis in airport parking lots already showed, finally had it from him. This is what it means for the city he built and is now watching come apart. To understand why the words carry the weight they carry, you have to understand who is saying them and what it costs him to say them. Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum is not simply a head of government acknowledging a crisis. He is the author of The Crisis's Context, the man who looked at a Creek settlement of 40,000 people in 1985 and decided it would become a city of millions, who ordered the Burj Khalifa when no rational economist could justify it, who approved the Palm Jumeirah when every infrastructure analyst in the world would have told him it was impossible. He justified it by building it imperfectly at occupancy rates that never hit projections, but enough to prove the improbable was possible, and that was sufficient to attract the capital that funded the next improbable thing. He built the landmarks that are now collapsing. Not structurally, the concrete is not fracturing, collapsing commercially, in occupancy, in the ways footfall data, vacancy rates, and transaction volumes describe without mercy. He built the airports that are now closing, not padlocked, emptying. Dubai International, 92 million passengers in 2024, the hub through which the world connected, is losing the load factors, the flights, the passengers that made it a hub, rather than simply an airport. He knows all of this. The silence before this speech was the silence of a man calculating whether saying it cost more than not saying it. He calculated that silence costs more, and he spoke. The Burj Khalifa, 2,723 feet, still standing, still lit. Occupancy rate in its 900 residential apartments, approximately 22% as of Q3 2026. That is 198 apartments, with someone sleeping in them. The remaining 702. Owned, service charges current, inspections conducted, dark. 702. Dark apartments in the world's tallest building. The Burj Al Arab sustained debris impacts on February 28th, not a direct strike, but fragments from an intercepted missile hitting the most photographed hotel in the Middle East. The facade was repaired within weeks. The sail shape is intact. The RevPAR has declined 47% in 12 months. A hotel commanding $1,800 average daily rate in 2023 is achieving $950 in 2026. Occupancy down from 78% to 54%. That is what collapsing means. The Palm Jumeirah. Walk the outer fronds on a Tuesday evening. Count the residential lights, not the street lights, which run on timers regardless. The count matches what satellite nighttime imagery shows. Scattered, isolated light, the pattern of ownership without occupancy expressed in photon. The Nakheel Mall below, anchors departed, spaces converted to fitness centers, the standard retail distress response. Corridors where to let signs have been in windows, long enough that the adhesive is beginning to separate from the glass. These landmarks are not collapsed in the cinematic sense. They are collapsing in the gap between what they were built to be and what they are, between designed occupancy and actual occupancy, between projected revenue and generated revenue. Sheikh Mohammed built every one of them, and he named what is happening to them. He called it collapsing. Dubai International processed 92 million passengers in 2024. In the 12 months following February 28, 2026, that volume declined. Not to zero, but in the specific, commercially consequential way that a 14 percentage point average load factor decline across primary routes represents. London, Moscow, Mumbai, Frankfurt, Toronto, Sydney, each carrying fewer passengers than before, each making the case, in airline revenue models, for frequency reductions not yet announced but already supported by the data. The reduction not yet announced is the closing not yet happened. When Emirates reduces Dubai-London from 14 weekly frequencies to 11, it will be reported as a scheduling adjustment. It will be a closing. Al Maktoum International, planned for 220 million annual passengers, built beside Dubai South, the ghost city, constructed for 1 million people who have not arrived. Al Maktoum processed 1.3 million passengers in 2026. It is not closed in any legal sense. The runway is operational, and the terminal is staffed. It is closing in the sense that it has never truly opened, built for a future that is receding rather than approaching. Sheikh Mohammed said airports are closing. He was not speaking of padlocks and darkened departure boards. He was speaking of aviation infrastructure, whose purpose depends on passengers who are no longer arriving at the rate it was built for. The airports are not padlocked. They are emptying, which is a slower and more painful kind of closing. The speech came 18 months after February 28th. 18 months of managed silence, of press releases, of record golden visa issuances, and accelerated D33 timelines and stability declarations, of the specific, disciplined, institutionally coordinated communications strategy of a government that understood that in a city built on belief, the ruler's words about a crisis are themselves an economic variable. He did not break the silence because the situation suddenly became worse. The situation has been declining on a consistent trajectory since February 28th. The population figure of 3.2 million, down from 4.1 million, leaked in August 2026. The real estate transaction data, the hotel RevPAR figures, the school withdrawal rates, the DIFC employment contraction, all of it has been in the public domain in disaggregated form for months. The data was available. The story was being told by the data, whether or not the government told it. He broke the silence because the cost-benefit calculation of silence changed. The specific trigger was the infrastructure. Buildings do not lie. Empty apartments are a statistical abstraction until they become visible on a specific night in a specific building where the windows are dark in proportions that any resident or visitor can observe without access to a database. The Burj Khalifa's dark floors are not a statistic. They are visible from the Fountain Promenade. They are visible from the observation deck of any competing building. They are visible from the Sheikh Zayed Road at night to anyone driving past. The airport does not lie. An airport processing fewer passengers than it processed the year before is an airport with shorter queues and emptier terminals and less noise in the arrival hall. The Emirati family driving to Dubai International to pick up a visiting relative notices that the pickup zone is less congested than it was. The taxi driver notices the fare volumes declining. The retail operator in Terminal 3 notices the footfall. The infrastructure's condition has become visible to the ordinary resident in a way that statistical releases could not produce. The collapse, the commercial operational revenue collapse that Sheikh Mohammed named, is now available to direct observation by anyone who uses the infrastructure. When the crisis is observable, without access to a database, silence becomes not the conservative choice, but the dishonest one. When every resident of Dubai can see with their own eyes that the landmark they pass every day is darker than it used to be, and the airport they use is quieter than it used to be, the government that does not acknowledge what the residents can see is not managing a narrative. It is conducting a public deception. Sheikh Mohammed is many things. A public deceiver in the presence of evidence that his own residents can verify directly is not one of them. He spoke because the infrastructure forced him to. The speech that contained the admission about collapsing landmarks and closing airports was not only an admission, it was structured, as all of Sheikh Mohammed's major communications are structured, to contain the admission within a framework that directs the audience from the problem to the response, before the problem has time to metastasize into the conclusion that the response is inadequate. The structure was acknowledge, contextualize, redirect, commit. Acknowledge. The landmarks are experiencing commercial pressures. The airports are operating at reduced capacity. The population has adjusted. He used the specific words that produced the headlines, collapsing, closing, because not using them when the evidence was visible would have made the speech incredible. You cannot address what you do not name. He named it. Contextualize. The pressures are the consequence of February 28th, of the regional security event that produced an unprecedented test of Dubai's resilience, of the geopolitical dynamics of a neighborhood that has never been fully within any city's control, regardless of the city's diplomatic skill. The contextualization converts the collapsing from a verdict on Dubai's model into a consequence of an external event. Dubai did not fail. Dubai was attacked. The distinction matters for the narrative, even if the commercial consequences are identical. Redirect, from the collapsing to the rebuilding. From the closing to the reopening. From the population adjustment to the repopulation plan. The 7-point plan that had been announced in the previous speech was referenced and expanded. New measures, larger commitments. The specific escalation of policy response that communicates seriousness of purpose, even when the policy instruments are variations on instruments previously deployed. Commit. Sheikh Mohammed's personal commitment to the recovery, not the government's commitment, not the UAE's commitment, his. the specific invocation of the personal authority that built the city as the guarantor of the city's rebuilding, the transfer of credibility from the institution to the individual. This is what I built. This is what I will rebuild. On my word, the structure worked as it was designed to work. Among the headlines were the admission, collapsing landmarks, closing airports. The speech's payload was the commitment. The admission was the door through which the commitment was made credible. You cannot be believed when you promise to fix something you have not acknowledged is broken. He acknowledged it is broken. The promise to fix it is therefore credible, in a way that the previous promises, which were made without the acknowledgement, were not. The speech was delivered in Arabic at 10 a.m. local time. The English translation was circulated by the UAE Government Media Office at 11:30 a.m. By noon, the speech had been processed by every major financial desk in London, New York, Singapore, and Hong Kong. The processing produced a specific market response, not the 1.1% net positive that the previous speech generated. Larger. The Dubai financial market, up 4.7% on the day of the speech, the largest single-day gain since February 28, 2026. The market reading the acknowledgement as the signal that the government had moved from denial to management, from the phase in which a crisis is not acknowledged to the phase in which it is being addressed. Real estate equities, Emaar up 6.2%. Nakhil's listed entities up 5.8%. Damac up 7.1%. The developers whose stock prices had tracked the 71% transaction volume decline, moving with the velocity of a market that had been waiting for the acknowledgement before it could price the recovery. The currency. The dirham is pegged to the dollar and does not move with the volatility of a free-floating currency. But the forward market, the derivative contracts that price future dirham exposure, tightened following the speech. The risk premium embedded in dirham forwards contracted by a measure that currency strategists described as significant for a pegged currency in a crisis environment. In London, the private banks that serve the high net worth community with Dubai exposure held the standard Tuesday morning calls that constitute their client communication cadence. The topic on every call was the speech. The client question on every call was the same. Does this change the calculation? The answer that the private banks gave, cautiously, with the qualifications that fiduciary responsibility requires, was, it changes one variable. The acknowledgement variable. The government now acknowledges the problem that the data has been describing. That acknowledgement is a precondition for the recovery, not the recovery itself. The calculation changes to the extent that a precondition for recovery being met is a positive development. It does not change to the extent that the recovery itself has not yet materialized in the data. In Singapore, the Economic Development Board noted the speech and continued processing the inbound investment inquiries that had been arriving at elevated rates since February. The Singapore EDB's assessment of the speech was operational rather than analytical. It did not change Singapore's attractiveness relative to Dubai. It confirmed that Dubai was managing a crisis in a way that serious governments manage crises, with eventual honesty about the nature of the challenge, which means the crisis is real and the management is credible, and the outcome depends on variables that the management cannot fully control. Singapore continued processing its inbound inquiries. Sheikh Mohammed said famous landmarks are collapsing. Here is the landmark by landmark reality of what that means in numbers. The Burj Khalifa, residential occupancy, 22%, down from 25% to 30% pre-February. Service charge collection rate, 94%. Owners paying the quarterly bill even from London and Moscow and Mumbai because the financial obligation is contractual and defaulting triggers legal proceedings they prefer to avoid. The Armani Hotel inside the Burj Khalifa, RevPAR, down 43% year-on-year. Atmosphere Restaurant on floor 122, covers down 38%. Occupancy of office floors 111 to 154, approximately 41%, down from 52% before February. The tallest building on earth, 22% residential occupancy, 43% hotel RevPAR decline, 41% office occupancy. The Burj Al Arab, ADR, $950, down from $1,800 in peak 2023. Occupancy, 54%, down from 78%. RevPAR, $513, down from $1,404. The most famous hotel in the Middle East, generating 37% of its peak revenue per available room. The Palm Jumeirah, residential occupancy across all property types, estimated 28 to 32%, down from 35% pre-February. Nakhil Mall anchor tenant occupancy, 61%, down from 74%. Beach club bookings across Palm venues, down 67% versus equivalent period 2025. Average minimum spend maintained at surviving venues, $130, down from $280. The Dubai Mall. As documented elsewhere, food court at 34% capacity at noon Thursday. Luxury corridor averaging 2 to 4 customers per store. Aquarium viewing panel crowd at 7% of 2019 equivalent. Staff to customer ratio approaching parity across the full floor plan. The Dubai Fountain. Promenade crowd at the 8:30 p.m. Friday performance, 280, down from an estimated 3,000 to 5,000 in 2019. Waterfront restaurant occupancy during fountain performance, 38%. Dubai International Airport. Inbound load factors, down average 14 percentage points across primary routes. Total passengers, Q1 2026 versus Q1 2025, down 31%. International arrivals by nationality, showing Russian visitor decline of 52%, British decline of 23%, Indian decline of 14%. Al Maktoum International Airport. Annual passenger volume 2026, projected 1.2 million, design capacity 220 million. These are the landmarks. These are the numbers. This is what collapsing looks like when it is not cinematically dramatic, but commercially precise. A king speaking about his kingdom's collapse is a specific kind of moment in the history of a place. It is the moment that divides the before from the after. The before is the period of managed silence, of press releases, of record, golden visa numbers deployed as counterweight to the departure data. The after is the period of acknowledged crisis and managed recovery. Which period produces better outcomes for the city is the question that history answers differently in different cases. The cases where the acknowledgement accelerated recovery. New York City in 1975, when Mayor Beam acknowledged the fiscal crisis that the Daily News famously headlined as Ford to City, drop dead. The acknowledgement allowed the restructuring. The restructuring allowed the recovery. New York in 1980 was a different city from New York in 1975. The cases where the acknowledgement confirmed the trajectory. Detroit, multiple acknowledgements across multiple mayors, across multiple decades. Each acknowledgement honest, each recovery plan genuine, the trajectory of decline sustained through the honesty in the plans because the structural conditions producing the decline were not addressed by the honesty or the plans. Dubai is not New York in 1975. It is not Detroit. It is a specific case with specific characteristics that do not map cleanly onto any precedent. It is a city with extraordinary structural advantages. The geography, the infrastructure, the legal framework, the zero income tax that are intact and durable. And it is a city with a specific structural vulnerability, the dependence on mobile capital's belief in unconditional safety that has been exposed in a way that the structural advantages cannot fully compensate for in the short term. The acknowledgement that Sheikh Mohammed has now made, the naming of collapsing landmarks and closing airports, is the precondition for the right kind of recovery, the recovery that is honest about what has happened and what it requires to reverse. What it requires to reverse is time and regional security stabilization, and the accumulation of months and then years of demonstrated stability that gradually rebuilds the institutional memory that February 28th disrupted. The policy framework can be built now. The golden visa categories, the corporate tax holidays, the real estate guarantees, the new airline routes, these can be put in place now. They constitute the infrastructure of the recovery. The infrastructure waits for the demand that regional stabilization will eventually produce, the word that 47 minutes of a speech cannot compress. The word that the financial community hears through the commitment and the acknowledgement and the personal authority of the man who built the city, eventually.